Behavior. Fixed action pattern. Sexual behavior. The motivations generate the behavior. Every species has their own basic fixed action patterns of sexual behavior. But along with that, a lot of selectivity within species. Selectivity. The fixed action pattern of one of the individuals constitutes the releasing stimulus for the other individual's fixed action pattern, which constitutes the releasing stimulus for the other individual's fixed action pattern. Ethology, in their own language and environment. Libido, sexual arousal and motivation. Attractivity, how attractive. Proceptivity, how receptive. Receptivity, active behaviors that carried out in response to being attracted to. Motivation vs performance. How people find information about sexual behavior. Joel Cohen. Sexual behavior and randomized responses. Female orgasms. One does not need to have orgasms to become pregnant. Are we the only species? Monkeys and apes as well. Also, to facilitates fertilization, facilitation. The more vaginal fluid, increases sperm motility. An orgasm, exhausts you enormously, so you might wind up being horizontal, so the sperm don't have to swim straight up against gravity. Reinforcement theory. Orgasms increase the likelihood to conceive. But the fertility and her propensity towards orgasm is not correlated. There is also heritability of orgasms. Why females have orgasms? It's a spandrel. Baggage that the same physiology occurs in females. Sexual behaviors unique in humans. Non-reproductive sex. But also, bonobos, and dolphins. Foreplay. But also, bonobo. Homosexuality. The only case when this happens in animals is when they are in cages. So, we're the only species. Egalitarian sex. Only a subset of individuals are allowed to reproduce, like marmosets. In humans, every culture has egalitarian sex. Something you do in private. People who are psychopathological confuse sexual behavior with violence. Masturbation. But also, chimps. And they eat the sperm afterwards. Fantasy. Probably also chimps, but we don't have enough info. Marriage. Almost 90% of people get married on every culture. Even though historically the majority of human cultures have been polygamous, nonetheless, the majority have been monogamous. But there's a lot less monogamy than we think. Alfred Kinsey. There's a lot less faith within pair bonding in USA. In reality, there's social monogamy but not necessarily sexual monogamy. E.g., the rate at which children have been fathered by someone claiming it's the father, it's a range between 10 to 40% of the children. Cheating. Romance and passion. It's only been established for about 50 to 40 years. Divorce. The average duration it's 2 to 4 years. Humans tend to being serial monogamists. Moving to one monogamous relationship to another, with a lag time corresponding to the interbirth interval. Limited and boring. Other species are regularly hermaphroditic. Or change sex aphoristically. Or parthenogenetic. In some snakes, the female doesn't need sperm from the males, she only needs to be around males. Neurobiology of sexual behavior. What's going on in the brain producing those fixed action patterns? Limbic system. Kluver-Bucy syndrome. When you damage different parts of the limbic system, you change the sexual behavior. But it's mainly because you are damaging which is related to emotions. Parts of the brain involved in sexual behavior. 1. Females. Ventral medial hypothalamus. Destroy the VMH, and you don't get sexual behavior anymore. Also, is the hotspot in the hypothalamus for receptors for estrogen and progesterone. Midbrain. Hormonal aspects of sexual behavior. Spinal pathways. Lordotic reflexes. 2. Males. Medial preoptic area. Testosterone receptors. Androgen receptors. Sexual performance. Amygdala, in charge of aggression. Sexual motivation. This is why it's more likely for males, who confuse sexuality with aggression. Autonomic nervous system. Erections. Parasympathetic nervous system, establishes the erection, transition to sympathetic full blast sympathetic equals ejaculation. It's the same physiology for clitoral erections in females. Vascular erection, increase blood flow into the penis, and you stop it from going out the other end, and thus you get vascular-driven engorgement. Last a lot longer. Muscular erection, in rodents, there's a muscle, the erector levi muscle, cell-bodied neurons in the spinal cord responsible for the erection. Occur a lot faster. Recovery time. For the sympathetic nervous system to go back to baseline post-orgasm. Slower recovery in females than in males. Brain regions that differed in size depending on your gender. Sexual dimorphism in the brain. Difference in size of the nuclei. Difference in the number of axons going through a bundle of fiber. Especially, a cluster of tiny nuclei in the hypothalamus. In a cluster, it's a little subset of neuronal cell bodies, where it's about twice the size in men as in women. It's a big effect. You almost can identify the sex of somebody by looking at the size of the in a cluster. Things in common. Physiology of orgasms. Failure of the transition from parasympathetic to sympathetic equals inability to reach orgasm, females, premature ejaculation, males. Neurobiology of pleasure and reward and anticipation. Dopamine in sexual behavior is the same in both sexes. Ventral tegmental area send dopaminergic projection to the nucleus accumbens different places in the brain equals normal sexual behavior. In clinical depression, you lost sexual interest. Mesolimbic dopamine system. Dopamine is about the anticipation of a reward, and also fueling the behaviors needed to achieve the reward. So, dopamine in this mesolimbic system as driving goal-directed behavior. E.g., you have a male. You show him a picture of someone who he assesses as being attractive, but don't necessarily hit this dopaminergic pathway to activate. It depends. Only if he is making eye contact, the dopamine system activates. On the other hand, if you show him someone he would rate as unattractive, when they're looking away, that's when the dopamine system activates. It also applies to men. Dopamine goes up when it knows you're about to get the reward. But not only the anticipation. But if you don't have the rise, you don't get the behavior, goal-directed behavior. But what happens if it gets the reward only half the time? The spike of dopamine is much higher. When you introduce the word maybe. This is intermittent reinforcement. You get more behavior when there is a maybe. But what about when they only get the reward 25% or 75% of the time? The spike is at the middle, between the 100 and 50%. Las Vegas convince people that there's 50% maybe, when in reality it's like 1%. And when you do that, you get dopamine like crazy, and you get goal-directed behavior. Different dopamine receptor subtypes in sexual behavior. D1 dopamine receptor. D2 dopamine receptor. D2, in rodents. They need to have D2 receptors to form the pair bond, for the attachment to occur. The second that happens, you need to have low levels of D2 and high levels of D1 to remain faithful in your pair-bonded relationship. So, after the pair bond occurs, there's downregulation of D2 and upregulation of D1. In humans, a higher ratio of D2 to D1 predicts more stable relationships. D2 equals formation of attachment. D1 equals maintenance of it, faithfulness. E.g. two groups. Relationship for 1 week together. Relationship for 5 years together. You flash on them subliminal images, and one of them is from their partner. In the 1 week relation, their dopamine system goes crazy. In the 5 years relation, their dopamine system doesn't activate. What activates is the anterior cingulate, having to do with empathy, comfort, etc. Species that do non-reproductive sex. It's because their endocrinology of ovulation is the thing that makes sex pleasurable. In females, it's the hormones associated with ovulation that sensitize various tactile receptors that mediate proximal pleasure. In males, it's the female giving off the right pheromones, driven by the right hormone levels that constitute the proximal signal of pleasurable anticipation. That's not the case with humans. But it's easier when estrogen levels are higher, ovulating. Frontal cortex. Regulating behavior, impulse control, gratification. To be appropriate in your sexual behavior. Someone with frontal cortical damage can have highly inappropriate sexual behavior. E.g., an 80 years man. Stroke damage to his frontal cortex. Who raped an 80 years woman with Alzheimer's. Proceptive sexual behavior. You're courting somebody. But there's another individual challenging you. And the frontal cortex is getting you to carry out those sexual behaviors. It's not changing the fixed action patterns of sex. It is changing the context in which the fixed action patterns occur. What are the hormonal responses to sexual behavior? Females. Increase progesterone-derived hormones, reinforcing pleasure. Increase testosterone-related hormones, androgens. Females generate androgens maybe 5% the levels of males. They come out of the adrenal glands. Mediating sexual motivation. If the women don't have adrenal glands, sexual motivation goes down. Give her replacement androgens, and sexual motivation returns. Release oxytocin. Oxytocin coming out of the posterior pituitary. Or, being another hypothalamic hormone that helps release ACTH from the pituitary, it's only a modulator. In this case, it works in the brain as a neurotransmitter and neuromodulator, which forms attachments, pair bonds, along with dopamine and D2 receptors. If you introduce oxytocin in the brain, they become more trusting. Or, they become more cooperative. Neuromarketing using oxytocin, so people are more likely to buy their products. Oxytocin comes out of the posterior pituitary, it has to do with nursing. So, sexual attachment is evolutionary a descendant of the neurobiology of mother-offspring attachment. Progesterone equals pleasure. Androgens equals motivation. Oxytocin equals attachment. Males. Up testosterone, elevations of testosterone in response to sexual behavior. The idea of high testosterone levels makes males more sexually active is non-existent. Vasopressin. Coming from the posterior pituitary. Vasopressin serves as neuromodulator role. Back to the monogamous voles, the expression of vasopressin receptor gene on neurons that release dopamine. Vasopressin stimulates dopamine neurons you decide you like to have sex with the other vole equals more sex. In polygamous voles, if you stick vasopressin receptors in those dopamine neurons, they become monogamous. The ones who have more vasopressin receptors are forming pair bonds faster. In primates, it's more complicated. Like in bonobos, even when they have the more monogamous gene, they are extremely polygamous. In humans, again, we are right in the middle. In the monogamous version you're more likely to remain married, and more likely to rate the marriage as stable and happy. You find mutations in vasopressin receptor gene, in family pedigrees with autism, which is a disease of very little attachment to other humans. Vasopressin equals attachment. Neurobiology of sexual orientation. Hypothalamic nucleus. On the average, men, their size of it is about twice the size as in women. Simon Levy. Homosexual men, on the average, they had the same size of this nucleus as you see in heterosexual women. Gender difference in the length of the second finger vs the fourth finger, the ratio of the two. On the average, homosexual men tend to have the finger length ratio of heterosexual women rather than of heterosexual men. Autoacoustic reflex. If you plug your ears up with your fingers, you'll hear a noise coming from the intrinsic vibration of something in your ears. That's the autoacoustic generating low hertz sounds. And the rate of oscillation differs by sex. So, homosexual men have the same autoacoustic reflex of heterosexual women. All of these has to do with prenatal hormone environment. In women's, same deal with the second to fourth finger ratio. And also, the autoacoustic reflex. Neurobiology of transsexuality. Parts of the brain that differentiate on size between genders. Bed nucleus of the stria terminalis. It's where the amygdala begins to send its projection into the hypothalamus. One type of neuron with certain type of neurotransmitter, which is about twice the size of males than in females. You can determine the sex of somebody by looking at number of these neurons. Transsexual people. They had the size of this part of the brain of the sex they insisted they actually were. Transsexualism is about people who got the wrong gendered body. They are chromosomally of one sex. Of their gonads, hormones, genitalia, secondary sexual characteristics of that sex. But they insisted that's not who I really am. This part of the brain agrees with them. Phantom limb system. You're a guy who got a penile cancer, so it is cut off. And about 60% of men wind up getting phantom penile sensations. And when you get a transgender person who go from male to female, 0% of penile phantom sensation. What in the environment release the fixed action pattern for sexual behavior? Depending on their language. Visual, turkeys, monkeys. In humans, males are more responsive to visual releasing stimuli. Also, you get more activation of the dopamine pathways in men. And you uniquely get activation of the amygdala as well, amygdala mainly involved in aggression. In this case is to male sexual motivation. Tactile, stimulate the right tactical receptors, and you'll activate dopamine regions. Some of this activates dopamine more than other types. The erogenous zones. Also, when women are ovulation, their skin is more sensitive to sexual arousing touch. In men, require testosterone. Lordosis reflex, where you get the lordotic arch backing in females. Only when they're ovulation, high levels of estrogen. Olfactory cues, pheromones. You need the right hormones in order to generate pheromones. Males need high testosterone levels. What chemicals constitute pheromones? All sort of fatty acids. And also, breakdown products of sex hormones. Androgens in males. Estrogens in females. It means, your olfactory system can pick up remnants of testosterone and estrogen. Perfume. Which is made out of sweat of various animals. Musk. Chanel No. 5 is made from the sweat of whipped Abyssinian cat's male. Synthetic perfumes are made of synthetic versions of androgens. Most perfumes are derived from male pheromones. What info is carried by pheromones? Species. Gender. Gonadally intact. Health. Terrified. It will smell different to the amygdala, it will have more glucocorticoid breakdown products in it. If it's related to you, you need to have hormones intact in order to generate the pheromones. Also, you need to have the right reproductive hormones on board in order to perceive them. Castrated males can't find the smells of female ovarian. Female with no estrogen equals can't distinguish the sweat of women and men. Male with no testosterone equals can't distinguish the sweat of women and men. Women become better at detecting the smell of men or women when she is ovulating. Homosexual men are better at detecting the smell of homosexual men than either heterosexual men or women.